Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining me on the topic today of can AI write my college essay? Ultimately, I'm going to recommend that no, you don't have AI write your college essay. And today we're going to go into some of the reasons why I suggest you can't do that. So before we start, just a little bit about me. I have been teaching and tutoring writing at the university level for over 10 years. I have an MA in creative writing, MS in education, and I've reviewed thousands of essays over my career. And most recently, I received a Fulbright scholarship to Kazakhstan, and I received training on how to write applications for that scholarship. And so a lot of my methods and knowledge that I use comes from what I learned writing that application. All right, so the first reason why I don't suggest you have AI write your college application is because this is what the Common App says. It gives the instructions for your Common App personal essay. So it says the essay demonstrates your ability to write clearly and concisely on a selected topic and helps you distinguish yourself in your own voice. All right, so there you have it. Number one, it's supposed to demonstrate your ability to write, and so if you use AI to do that in a overwhelming way, then you're going to be defrauding the process and, not being honest, lying to the universities you're applying to. It won't be accurately reflecting your writing ability, which this is a test of. And the other reason why AI shouldn't write your essay is the second part of this first sentence, right? Is that it helps you distinguish yourself in your own voice. And so AI by default is well, almost certainly not going to be your own voice. And so, and then also by default, the way AI generally works is that it gives you the most common responses to the questions that you ask it. And so, sort of by default, there, it will not help you distinguish yourself. It'll, in fact, do the opposite. It'll make you blend in. So, what we're going to do today is look at a couple of essays that I had. In this case, I use, for example, ChatGPT, but it doesn't really matter which, AI we're talking about, but we'll use that as the example. So we're going to look at two essays that I had ChatGPT create. And so I will switch to that now. All right, so um, I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview here about what we're going to see in this first essay. So what I did is I had ChatGPT write two drafts. The first draft I gave it the prompt just write me a generic, you know, college essay, and it spit out a response. And so these are the sort of bullet points I came up with my sort of analysis of its attempt to do that. And so I didn't give it any other particular instructions, right? So this is just sort of out of the box, the default response that the kind of response that you're going to get. So ultimately, it came up with the story it came up with has a pretty simplistic message, right? It doesn't say this literally in the essay, but it basically boils down to, some adage like patience is a virtue. And so that is not going to help you distinguish yourself at all if that's all you're saying is something as simple as that. So ultimately, what we're going to see is it tells the story of a student's experience making coffee with their dad every morning in their teenage years. And so ultimately, like I already mentioned, the sort of overall simplistic message is that it taught them patience. And so it does tell the story, and then to some extent, it kind of does a pretty decent job. Um, but it really just tells mostly the story of impatience, and then doesn't really, although the student sort of claims that it taught them patience, it doesn't really go into that story, give evidence or kind of proof that that was the case, right? They sort of just state it. And so they also don't really give an indication of why this was important to their life, what kind of impact it had on their life. So they're claiming that they learned sort of patience through this experience, but then they don't give any examples of how that actually improved their life. And so we get a few examples that sort of start to do that, but then ultimately, sort of very unconvincingly, try and make that claim. And then also there's certainly no explicit argument about why, a college admissions officer who's reading this would find this compelling or important, and be a good argument as to why they should accept this student into the college. And so ultimately the revisions I would suggest on an essay like this, which um, again, AI is giving you the most common responses to your answer. So this is, in a sense, a possible sort of plausible essay of a first draft that you might write. And so the revisions to something like this, I would say, would be to make it more specific. Ultimately, the sort of lessons claimed to have been learned here are not very specific to the individual. The story is, and there's sort of examples of impatience are, but the patience is not. So to give some more stories in more detail about, the success of their implementing patience in their life. And then that would at least go further in, making it clear why this is an important attribute that would help them succeed in at college. But it would also be improved if there was an explicit statement that more convincingly ties it directly to how it's going to improve and help them succeed in their college experience. All right, so those are my initial remarks, and so we're just going to go ahead and take a look at the essay. So again, I just prompted it to give me a generic college essay, so nothing fancy or anything. What it gave me back was 416 words, and so the Common App essay is 650 word limit. And so you really want to try and get closer to that than not. And so this is significantly shorter than the word limit. And so the writer here still has some room to do the suggestions I have. All right, so the first sentence, right? It says, I used to hate waking up early on Saturdays. And so the first sentence is, gonna be pretty important. And as far as first sentences go, this is not great, but it could be worse, right? It implies that they used to have a feeling, and then we're going to see some sort of transformation, right? They used to hate waking up on Saturdays, but now they do, right? So it already sets up some sort of like mystery about, okay, why did they hate it, and why, hopefully, do they love it now? Um, Ultimately, we're actually going to see something that even undercuts that whole initial statement, because ultimately I'll skip to the end, give you a little bit of preview. Um, the the second to last line here is I still don't love waking up early, right? And so this even kind of undercuts what that is setting up in the beginning is some sort of transformation. It's like I used to not like it, but also I still don't like waking up early now. So that's, something that AI obviously doesn't know what it's saying, and so it can be sort of contradictory. And we get that as an example here. But anyway, I used to hate waking up early on Saturdays. While my friends slept in, I would drag myself out of bed to the sound of my dad moving around the kitchen downstairs. By the time I made it to the kitchen, still half asleep, he would already have the coffee beans measured out and the kettle heating on the stove. Without saying much, he would hand me the grinder. At first, it felt like a chore. I didn't understand why we couldn't just use a coffee machine like everyone else. But every Saturday, we followed the same routine. Grind the beans, boil the water, pour slowly, wait. My dad approached it with the kind of patience I didn't have. I rushed through each step. He paid attention to the details I couldn't even notice. The smell of the beans after grinding, the temperature of the water, the speed of the pour. Slow down, he would say whenever I got impatient. For years, I thought he was talking about the coffee. All right, so we're already about halfway through this essay, and we get this start of a story of, the sort of routine of making coffee in the morning and the students dissatisfaction with having to do that. But again, so in this instance, it's about half the essay, and we don't really have any idea why we're being told this story, right? And it's not a super interesting or compelling story. It does have some details. I mean, it's not terrible, but it's certainly not obvious at this point why we're being told this. Um, so the first sort of hint that we of the reason about why we're getting told this is here towards the end of this first half, which is slow down. He would say, whenever I got impatient for years, I thought he was talking about the coffee. So this is implying that, we're learning a bigger lesson here and it's going to be important. And so again, we're still not even getting a clear picture of what that is going to be. And so we still just have very vague notions of what we're even being told about here. So if we continue, we have as I got older, those Saturday mornings became less about the drink itself and more about the ritual around it. While we waited for the coffee to brew, we talked. Sometimes about school, sometimes about family, sometimes about nothing important at all. It became a space where conversation happened naturally, not forced, not scheduled, just part of the routine. I started noticing how much care existed in small actions, the way my dad folded the coffee filter exactly along the seam, the way he warmed the mug before pouring, the way he never rushed the process even when there was nowhere we needed to be. Okay, so at that point, we're starting to be told, right, lessons learned by the student. And one of the lessons learned that gets a little bit more specific than just learning patience, right? Is that while doing this sort of seemingly unnecessary ritual, it was easier for the student and their dad to talk. And um, so they learn this lesson of some sort of activity can kind of help people talk, which again is pretty general. I mean, it's not nothing, but also at this point, there's no real explanation of what kind of impact that had on them. Was there some, very profound conversation that they had that really sort of changed the student's perspective and then had some sort of tangible result, right? Did they start doing better in school? Did they get better grades? Or did their relationship improve? Did something come of it? We don't really get an explanation of why something like that would be important, right? And so basically the same thing happens with this next section here, right? Which is I started noticing how much care existed in small actions. So we get this student observing small actions, the way my dad folded the coffee filter exactly along the seam, small detail, the way he warmed the mug before pouring, the way he never rushed the process, even when there was nowhere we needed to be. So again, it doesn't even say, on all those small actions led up to a great cup of coffee. It doesn't even say that. So again, we get no sort of indication as the impact of what the care put into these small actions um, came away from. And then, as you notice, if we read this kind of quickly, it all seems to make sense. But sometimes if you narrow in and zoom in on some of the sentences, then we start to see some problems here. So we get this sentence, the way he never rushed the process, even when there was nowhere we needed to be. So you kind of know what is meant by that sentence, but it's actually saying sort of the opposite of what you would expect. So, in other words, we have the second part of the sentence that is stating, when there was nowhere we needed to be, even then, he never rushed the process. And so that really just kind of doesn't make sense. Why would you ever rush a process if you didn't have anywhere you needed to be? So the sentence really should have been the way he never rushed the process, even when we had somewhere to be, right? Even when we were in a rush or something like that. So again, AI a lot of times, can make some kind of mistakes like this where it sounds like a sentence you would say, but under closer examination, it actually kind of doesn't make sense. All right, so we will keep reading here. Eventually, I began making coffee before he came downstairs. What once felt inconvenient became something I looked forward to. I found comfort in repetition and meaning in details I used to ignore. More importantly, I began carrying that mindset into other parts of my life. In school, I became someone who rereads the instructions before starting. In group projects, I listen longer before speaking. In my relationships, I've learned that showing up consistently in small ways often matters more than dramatic gestures. Okay, so here is basically the biggest best attempt at um, the student trying to claim that they learned some sort of lesson here and then applied it in other areas of their life and giving examples. So this is sort of the bare minimum of doing that that ultimately doesn't really say that much, right? So they're saying it changed their behavior in school. They became someone who rereads the instructions, right? And so, sure, it's implied that then you're going to do better in school after that, but it's not really stated explicitly, right? And so, same thing here in group projects. I listen longer before speaking. Okay, that can be a good thing to do, but certainly not always. And so, was there some example where that really paid off really well? We're still not getting that. In my relationships, I've learned that showing up consistently in small ways often matters more than dramatic gestures. Okay, that could be true. We might even believe it to be true for ourselves, but we get no sort of indication about why this particular student, right, thinks that's important. So we get some examples of how it potentially played out in their life, but no real actual evidence or stories about how that happened. So that would be one of my big suggestions here, right? Is we already got this big, story about making coffee and impatience, basically. And so ultimately, you should sort of put equal importance on one moment where you applied the lesson. And then basically, we should have the same kind of length story highlighting, going into more detail in one of these examples, right? Tell us a story, give us the example about when you were in a group project and you listened longer before speaking, and there was some sort of big payoff, right? Ultimately, we're just left up to taking the student's word for it that these had, you know, uh, positive benefits. All right, so we'll keep going here, right? It says, coffee taught me patience, but not because of the brewing itself. It taught me that worthwhile things usually take longer than we expect, and that slowing down enough to notice the process can change how we experience it. I still don't love waking up early, but on Saturday mornings, I wake up before my alarm, walk downstairs, and start the kettle. All right, so again, we get this sort of bizarre, basically in the same sentence. Um, that slowing down, they learn that slowing down enough to notice the process can change how we experience it. But then in the very next sentence, they say, well, I still don't love waking up early. So their experience didn't even change, right? So they're claiming that it did, but then ultimately it didn't really have that big an impact on them, right? So the whole thing just kind of undercuts itself here at the end. And so, like I mentioned, AI can kind of certainly, if you don't pay too close attention, you read quick, you know what this thing is trying to say, right? You know this kind of story. But if you really look in more detail, it kind of starts to not make a whole lot of sense. So that is the first draft. And I already went over sort of the revision suggestions that I would apply to this essay. But so now what I'm going to show you is sort of a second draft attempt. So after I just asked ChatGPT to give me sort of a generic example of a college essay, I asked it to revise this essay and give me an exemplary version, right? And so it did change it. And ultimately, what we're going to see, so I'll give you sort of my key takeaways before we look at the next essay, the second draft of it. So the biggest difference you'll notice pretty much immediately, right, is the storytelling does seem to uh, be a little bit better or even significantly better, right? It's adding, a much thicker description of the story. It's going to give you more sensory details. We got kind of some of just the basic facts, of the story of making coffee in the first draft. And so that really is going to be pretty pumped up in the second version. So it is going to appear to be, more well written, the second draft. Ultimately, though, all of the same drawbacks still are going to apply. Ultimately, it still boils down to sort of the simplistic message again, something like patience is a virtue. And there's still no examples given of times when and how that patience later actually paid off, right? And so again, we're going to get those same sort of brief examples given, and we actually get more of them in this draft, but they're still very superficial and don't really give us a good idea. And then ultimately, what I'll kind of go through is that even though the story does appear better written, especially, like I said, some of the sensory details, they really don't add anything to telling us about the student. So it tells us more about sort of the details of the scene and what can be found there and a little bit about what it might be like to have been there. And it gives you a greater ability to sort of picture that, imagine that in your head, which can be a little bit more engaging just in and of itself. But beyond that, it doesn't really tell us any more about the inner life of the student. And so we'll see that when we look at the essay. So once again, I asked it to give me a second draft of an exemplary college essay. And so this time it gave us 775 words. So this is actually too long. This is, you know, longer than the 650 word limit that the Common App has. So, but then ultimately, it still doesn't really give us a part two. It's basically just expanding on what we just read. So let's take a look. All right, by the time I reached the bottom stair, the kitchen already smelled like toasted hazelnuts and something darker, bitter, almost smoky. My dad was standing at the counter in socks and a faded blue t-shirt, tapping the side of the kettle with his knuckle like he was checking if it was ready. All right, so already, we even notice you get something like we get the smell of toasted hazelnuts, right? Not even just, so first of all, we're getting a smell. I don't think we got that in the first draft. And not just a smell of hazelnuts, but we get a smell of toasted hazelnuts, right? So we get adjectives and of these sensory details and descriptions. We get a little bit better picture, right? The student walking down the stairs, bottom stairs. And then we actually start to get something like a, pretty interesting description here. We get the smell of toasted hazelnuts and something darker, and then it kind of pauses there. And so that actually even sets up, you know, some sort of even bigger mystery if we're taking that sort of metaphorically, is we're getting some sort of, underbelly of something that seems pretty, innocuous on the surface. Um, but ultimately, that detail is only and just referring to something that's bitter and almost smoky, which of course is gonna be the coffee. And so so ultimately, this is kind of a misleading detail to do it this way. And so that's really actually kind of a poetic way to do it, right? Is to mention something darker and then separate it from what it actually literally refers to, sort of indicating that this is also going to refer to something about the experience. But ultimately, it doesn't, right? And then again, we get some more details here about dad standing at the counter, what he's wearing and socks and a faded blue t-shirt. Interestingly, we don't get, we just get those two details. We don't know if dad's wearing pants. And so we're left wondering why we're being told about just the socks and the t-shirt. And then we get this a little bit more of a detail here, tapping the side of the kettle with the knuckle like he was checking if it was ready, which is a description of an action. But again, I mean, so we've painted a scene here, we got some details, but we really don't know what any of this means at this point and doesn't appear to mean all that much. but it's painting the scene as, is often recommended. So we'll keep going. Without looking up, he slid the hand grinder across the counter toward me. That was our Saturday morning exchange for years. No good morning, no how do you sleep, just the grinder. All right, and then so yes, we get a pretty odd interaction and ritual and routine with dad here in the morning. No words are exchanged, just pretty, abrupt sliding the grinder and saying, okay, we have, a job to do or something. And so ultimately, again, if I were to provide some suggestions, what is the more important thing about this story here, right? It's obviously not about, literally and only the coffee, although ultimately that's really all we get. What would be more sort of personal and interesting and meaningful is if they go into a little bit more about their relationship with their dad. And so, but again, we just get sort of the surface level symptoms of this thing, but without any real actual thoughts from the student about these kinds of behaviors that ultimately are kind of weird, right? Um, all right, so we'll continue, and we got I would twist the metal handle while coffee beans cracked apart between the burrs with a dry, crunchy resistance. My arm would start to ache halfway through, and I'd switch hands dramatically, hoping he'd notice and take over. He never did. So again, we kind of get very little response from dad here. And so ultimately, I think this is actually probably the best paragraph, the best few sentences, the best piece of writing in this essay that ChatGPT wrote, because ultimately, I mean, what is the literal point here being depicted is that their arm is starting to ache, right? And so all the other details that we get surrounding this sort of contribute and point towards this experience of an arm ache, of some pain, right? Which then ultimately is kind of symbolic of the emotions that they're going through, which is some sort of pain or confusion, around at least initially this ritual that doesn't make sense. Why are they doing it by hand when they can just, use a coffee maker? And so all of these details, right? Twisting a metal handle, kind of something hard here, beans cracking, right? Obviously, also a kind of sense of breaking apart and pain, right? We get burrs with a dry, crunchy resistance. So all of these adjectives are contributing to sort of a harsh environment, a harsh action that is leading to their arm aching, right, after doing this. And so this really kind of gives us the experience that the student is having. And so that's all done just by sort of the physical description. And so like I said, this actually is probably the best few sentences in this essay because yes, it's giving us specific details for us to imagine and visualize what's going on, but then it's also symbolic of the inner life and the inner experience of the student. And they're not just literally telling us, and hey, I felt uncomfortable. I would feel uncomfortable in these moments, right? When we would have these sort of bizarre, weird rituals. It's doing that again, sort of symbolically by mentioning this a sort of physical uncomfortability when going through this. But so that is the best pieces of writing, and that's where that's going to end. So if we continue, we get almost there, he'd say, even though there was clearly a lot left. When I was younger, I found the whole ritual absurd. So we're going to get some explicit reflection from the student, right? And so kind of driving home the point that we just. So this is a little step above uh, the draft we saw before, right? Here we get the story of the coffee grinder and the ritual. And it is a little bit better. The details are more vivid and easier to imagine. And then we're also going to get some explicit reflection, what the student thought about this whole thing, right? When I was younger, I found the whole ritual absurd. We owned a perfectly functional coffee machine. It sat 3 feet away from us on the counter, capable of producing coffee in under 2 minutes with the press of a button. Instead, every Saturday, we insisted on doing it the slowest possible way, boiling water in the kettle, folding the paper filter by hand, wetting it, blooming the grounds, then pouring in slow spirals while watching steam curl up against the kitchen window. So, so like I said, here we get some explicit actual, interior reflection from the student on this experience. Um, and then we still get an attempt here at physical description of what is going on. But then, unlike the example that I just went through that I thought was good, right, where the physical description mirrors um, the experience that the student was having. Here we do get a list of, so what's the main point here, right, is we're doing this in the slowest way possible. And so a good version of a description of this process would really kind of drag out and convey some sort of uncomfortability or dissatisfaction with having to go through this. But ultimately, we just get a pretty straightforward list of facts about the procedure. And so that's sort of like minimally sufficient in terms of giving us an actual idea of how slow this process was, but it's not described in a negative way like we saw with the arm ache and cracking the beans, right? It's just pretty matter of fact. And then actually what we get is actually even kind of a positive description, right? Boiling water in the kettle, folding the paper filter by hand, wetting it, blooming the ground. So that even reminds us of like blooming flowers, right? And so that even seems like of a positive description right there, right? And then we get then pouring in slow spirals, which is also kind of a nice image, right? And then definitely here we get watching steam curl up against the kitchen window. And so this actually paints kind of a nice scene, but what the student was trying to convey was this sense of, being upset that it had to be really slow. So again, you get the sense and the appearance that this is better writing because you get more sort of sensory details, you get a better picture, but then ultimately that doesn't really match with the student's inner experience. And so that's why I was saying, on the one hand, it appears to be better written, but ultimately doesn't really match up and tell us more about the student's inner life. All right, so we'll continue. We get it felt inefficient in the way childhood often defines inefficiency, anything that takes longer than necessary. All right, and so this is one of the more bizarre sentences in this whole essay is, you know, why is this student trying to make a claim about, childhood in general and claiming that all children or certainly are going to most often define inefficiency as anything that takes longer than necessary. It's just not important. I mean, the only reason why you would do that is more like you're trying to appear smart, right? And you're describing some sort of fact of life, but then ultimately it's not clear at all where that is coming from, except for just this one individual's experience, right? And it certainly doesn't ring true for me that this is true or something that is commonly a commonly held belief that childhood often defines inefficiency as something that takes a long time. It's certainly sort of plausible, right? But it's just a weird thing to try and do in an essay when you're trying to just say things about yourself, right? You're not really trying to make claims about all of humanity or life. And that's when you get sort of like cliched messages and things like that, which is what we ultimately kind of overall get here, which is again, sort of patience is a virtue. So here we go. We get the sort of explicit mentioning of this now. I was impatient with everything back then. I rushed through homework to get outside faster. I skimmed instructions and assembled furniture backward. I interrupted stories before people finished telling them because I assumed I knew where they were going. Even while grinding coffee, I'd cranked the handle too fast, sending tiny flakes of ground scattering across the counter. My dad would brush them into his palm and say the same thing every time. Slow down, let it do what it's supposed to do. All right, so this is actually kind of a fine move, right? So we just got this one specific story about sort of confusion and dissatisfaction with this coffee grinding ritual. And so they're claiming that now they're starting to claim that it was, um, reflective of just their nature at the time, which is impatience, right? And then so just going on and giving a list of other aspects of their life where they exhibited impatience is kind of fine here, right? Because you've already given the one specific example. And so to kind of just quickly go through and not at all any detail into any of these, but you're just kind of trying to paint a broad picture. This is actually fine in this example. But what we're going to see later is this same sort of tendency applied to patients, which then ultimately they don't give a detailed story for. So, kind of so far so good. Although the other sort of drawback here with just giving this list is we still don't really get a sense that this impatience really negatively impacted their life to some significant importance, right? So we get some attempts at that, right? Is that their impatience has caused them to assemble furniture backward. And then the only other negative impact here, right, is that when they were rushing through grinding coffee, they got flakes over the counter, right? But so those are just sort of like literal details and doesn't really go into, again, the emotional impact or turmoil that that might have caused the student. So we'll keep going here. So it's still kind of superficial. So we get dad saying, slow down, let it do what it's supposed to do. And then we get, for a long time, I thought he was talking about the coffee. So we get this sort of generalization of impatience showing up in many places in their life. And then again, we get an explicit statement here about, okay, I know I've been talking a lot about coffee, but I'm actually not really talking about coffee. And then so here's where we expect to sort of have the point driven home about the importance and what it is we're talking about here at all anyway. But so let's see what happens. So the point was the pause before the day began. The 7 or 8 unremarkable minutes spent standing shoulder to shoulder in a quiet kitchen while the kettle hissed. The conversations that happened because neither of us was looking directly at the other. The way silence could feel full instead of awkward when your hands were busy. And so, okay, we're starting to get heading in the direction of why this is more important than just a sort of, again, unremarkable ritual about making coffee. And hopefully, what we're going to get then again is really the impact on the student's life. So we'll see if we get that. We get while the coffee dripped, we talked about ordinary things, whether the tomato plant in the backyard was dying, why my math teacher graded so harshly, what movie we would watch that night, but sometimes without warning, the conversations widened. College, money, his childhood, the job he almost took in another state before I was born, things he might never have sat me down to say formally, but something said while waiting for water to pass through the grounds. I learned that some conversations require an activity beside them, something to absorb the pressure. So ultimately, this is the big takeaway we get from these experiences, right? Um, is that actually then, and then so again, we could have had something a little bit more deeper about their relationship with their dad, but instead we actually get a very general, we kind of go the other way and go back to general and just say, hey, I kind of learned that, conversations can sometimes happen easier when you're doing an activity. And so, again, we were looking for some sort of, important impact that this had on the student's life. And we almost get there, right? We get a sort of specific mention. Oh, we had that one conversation about that job he almost took in another state before I was born, right? Indicating that that was important for some reason. But ultimately, we have no idea why. I mean, to us, it's just, you know, the student learned something that didn't happen about the dad's life, that they almost moved to another state. And we're left completely guessing as to why that was important. And we just have to take their word for it. So instead of getting something very specific about what that meant to them, we just get this general, hey, sometimes it's better to do something while you talk. All right, so we'll keep going. Eventually, I started waking up before him. The first time I made the coffee alone, I ground the beans too coarse and poured the water too quickly. It came out weak and sour. My dad drank it anyway. Pretty good, he said after a sip. It wasn't. But the next weekend, I adjusted the grind. The weekend after that, I lowered the water temperature. I began noticing details I used to ignore, how freshly ground coffee clumped slightly from released oils, how water poured too close to the filter could bypass the grounds entirely, how a few seconds changed the flavor, tiny variables almost invisible with outsized consequences. All right, so again, we were heading towards, sort of a more personal realization, but then now we go back to again just the mechanics of grinding coffee, right? Which again, we're really trying to dig to some sort of more deeper importance, but then we just go back up to superficial. Why would a admissions officer need you to prove that you can make a good cup of coffee, right? It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense at this point. So we do again get sort of a key takeaway attempt here, which is that actually that tiny variables, almost invisible, have outsized consequences, right? But so all we've gotten so far is perhaps that these variables make a better cup of coffee. And we don't really get how that impacts the interpersonal sort of life of the student. So we'll keep going. We'll see if we get there. Paying attention became a habit. So again, now we're talking about a broadening generalization. This actually turned into not just an instance, right, but a habit in my life. It carried into the rest of my life, into writing essays where one sentence rhythm could shift the meaning of a paragraph, into conversations where listening closely changed what someone was actually asking, into leadership roles where the mood of a room could hinge on one person feeling unheard. I began to understand that details are rarely just details. They're often the mechanism by which larger things succeed or fall apart. So again, we're trying to then now show the consequences of a lesson learned of how um, adapting and implementing patience into the student's life had some profound impact on them. But again, we just get this sort of brief list of general observations and examples with no real detail or evidence or proof that these really had any kind of meaning or outcome, right? And so this is where my suggestion would be pick one of these details, one of these examples. Um, into conversations where listening closely changed what someone was actually asking, into leadership roles where a mood of a room could hinge on one person feeling unheard. Like you told us the story of your impatience with coffee, tell us the story of this leadership role where the mood changed because you noticed someone was feeling unheard. Instead, we just got more, sort of granular details on the coffee making process itself rather than on a more deep impact on the person as a whole. So we'll keep moving. Even now, our Saturday routine is mostly unchanged. The grinder still catches occasionally on lighter roasts. My dad still warms his mug before pouring. The coffee machine still sits untouched nearby, technically more efficient and completely irrelevant. And so again, we kind of get what we saw at the end of the first draft of this is this sort of undercutting of the whole purpose you might think this is going towards, but it just reverts back to okay, and actually most things didn't end up really changing, right? I still make coffee with him when I'm home. The ritual no longer feels like waiting for something else to begin. It is the beginning, and every time I pour in slow circles over the grounds and watch them rise, bloom, and settle, I think about how many important things in life work that way, requiring patience, attention, and trust in a process that reveals itself only if you don't rush. All right, so we kind of get a description of um, the the students saying their experience changes now with the ritual of coffee. They don't feel sort of lost and confused and sort of trapped in a meaningless habit, but that they sort of relax and sort of can see some sort of importance. But But again, that's all we get. Like you could have at least gone into more detail and showed us the experience of you having that with the coffee, if nothing else. But even then, that wouldn't have been ideal. It still would have been a better idea to show their inner experience going through a time when patience, really paid off, something like that. So, I already kind of went through and reviewed a little bit my suggestions on what would make this essay better, but basically it was going to be going into a second story about the big impact. And so ultimately, we don't get this. So, what you could do with AI now, right, is basically like copy and paste the sort of drawbacks that you found into it and say, okay, now revise this essay given this feedback. But so that's what I tried to do after this essay. I said, hey, pick one of these examples. Um, Pick one of these examples where you showed and sort of implemented patients into your life, and give us that story, expand on that story. But then ultimately, it actually ended up just like getting rid of them and not going into detail in any of them. And so ultimately, the point here being is once you start and get to a point and start giving the AI suggestions to revise, it starts dropping those suggestions or can't really fully implement it, or at the very least, it's going to take an increasingly amount of more work and more detail that you're giving it in order to improve the essay. So this is about as good as the essay can get with very little effort. And so in order to really have it right, something good and follow sort of the suggestions that I'm giving here is you got to put a lot of effort into it, at which point you might as well just write the essay yourself, right? Rather than going back and forth with AI and trying to get it to do it for you. Because the other thing that I haven't even mentioned yet, right, is I wasn't even concerned. I mean, so I was asking it to write the essay. This has basically completely nothing to do with my experience, right? I didn't say, "Hey, I had this coffee ritual routine with my dad. Write my college essay about that," right? It just came up with an example. And so even to get this, right, you still have to give it some factual information for it to actually reflect your experience. And so even getting it to produce this sort of generic prompt version of it would actually take much more work than what I just ended up doing, which was just say, hey, write me a generic college essay. And so again, if you had to put even more work into, getting to this kind of not great example of a draft, then it almost certainly it just made up these details. It almost certainly would just be making up details that don't have anything to do with your actual experience either. And so you would even have to go back and forth with AI a few times in order to get sort of uh, the story to factually accurately represent your experience. And so that would take a lot of time and effort even to get it to do that, which again, you might as well have just written it yourself. And so all that time and energy spent into that, and you still are only left with a not a very great, excuse me, draft. And so then you have to go through that same process of then trying to get it to accurately reflect your interior life. So we do get some more explicit reflection from the student on their experience of this. But again, just like you would have had to give it the facts about the actual story, you would have to give it the facts about your actual experience. So ultimately, you would be inputting all those examples and essentially just writing the thing yourself before it even spit out the an essay. And so again, you might as well just go ahead and write the essay because the other thing then that is going to happen is let's just say you did all that, you put all that work into it. And let's say you get this, or you get even a better example. Let's say you even get it to give you the factual second story that I've been recommending about how there was some big payoff of some specific example of you applying patience in your life. Then we have the whole other question of, okay, does this sound like you? And almost certainly it's not going to, right? Or it's not going to sound like the distinguished version of you that the Common App is asking for. Because again, what does AI do by default? It gives you the most common examples of whatever prompt you're giving it. And so in other words, this is the most common and what the most common way that most people would write this story. And so this is just by default not your voice. And even if this was your voice and this was how you wrote it, it's ultimately going to be pretty forgettable because that's how most students are going to write it. So if and only if you get to this next step of some exemplary version of a basic draft, then you have to go through the whole process of trying to tell it about how to write like you. And from my own experience, that's virtually just impossible, right? Because even I can't, do an excellent or easy job of explaining my own personal style to you and how I go about do that. Ultimately, how is it easy for me to sound like me? It's just me writing what I would write. And so I don't have to think about it and say, oh, well, I would use this word and not this word. I actually use these grammar structures, right? And not that one. And so that's why trying to get a really exemplary essay from AI that really accurately and distinguishes you as much as possible is virtually impossible and just going to be much more work than it's worth. So we will go ahead and stop there. Right now, I'll just go over some common questions that we might get from this kind of presentation. So before we do that, I'll just give a little bit of a plug here. So instead of having AI write your essay, what should you do? What would be more beneficial, right, is talking to someone like me. And so here's a QR code for booking a free consultation with me. And so I can sort of talk you through the process. Ultimately, I'm not going to write your essay for you, right? So we are getting rid of all of the same sort of drawbacks you're going to get with AI, which ultimately is it's not going to be reflective of your writing ability. It's not going to be reflective of your voice. So I am not going to write your essay for you, so we don't run into those kind of problems. But what I do is trying to get you deeper into your own personal story, whereas what you might come up with initially is that sort of generic version of the essay. The question is, how do we go deeper into that, right? How do we go into the deeper interiority of your life and what you felt and experienced, and how does those experiences are going to distinguish you from other people? And then also, how do we more genuinely and thoroughly develop your voice? And so that are some of the things we can do talking. On a video call here. Or you can email me any questions there at spencer.harrison@prestigewritingconsulting.com. And there'll also be a link below the video. All right, so let's just address some common lingering questions now. So I already basically answered this question, right? But can I use AI or would that be considered cheating? So once again, the short answer is yes, that would be cheating. Because you're not you're displaying your own writing ability. You're just giving it what AI came up with. And so ultimately, there are, I think, useful uses for AI, but that would stay at the brainstorming and outlining phase, which is, I think, as far as you would want to go with AI. So having it do what I was just showing you examples of is having it write the draft. That would be cheating. All right, and so here's another big questions, right? Can admissions officers tell when an essay was written by AI? And so ultimately, the short answer is not always, not necessarily. There's no, at this point, really reliable way to tell if something was written by AI. there are those, sort of AI checkers where you can put a piece of writing into the software, and it's supposed to be able to tell you what percentage, of the essay was likely written by AI. But there's any number of examples, and you can try it yourself of putting in an example of your own writing that you actually wrote, and it'll say, there was some amount, at least some amount of, if not even sometimes, a high probability that a lot of it came from AI. So AI checkers at this point are not really reliable, and so then they can be helpful, but then also then it's just left up to the reader's own, familiarity with AI, and when they read your essay, does it strike them as AI? Ultimately, if you did have AI write it, it likely will strike someone as at least pretty similar to AI. And then they'll just be suspicious about your essay and not really want to, give you the stamp of approval. At best, even if it, somehow doesn't sound like AI or they don't suspect it, hopefully what we went through today is, shows you that the example is not going to be good. Even if they don't suspect it's AI, they're just going to be like, okay, well, this is an unimpressive example of a college essay, and it's not going to do you any good. And at worst, you're going to be assumed to be cheating and disqualified. So not really worth it to have it do that. Um, all right, so I already started to talk about this. What is okay to use AI for, right? Brainstorming, outline, coming up with ideas. I think that's all fine. You can even ask it to, once you do write a draft, you can give it to AI and say, hey, give me feedback on my college essay that I just wrote and tell me how to improve it. I've done this with some pieces of writing or student writing as examples. And oftentimes, on early drafts, it can give pretty good or decent feedback for you to consider because ultimately on the early drafts, there's really just common suggestions that someone like me or a teacher is going to give you on how to improve the story, right? Like add more sensory detail or something like this. And so AI is already going to know those early common suggestions that if you do implement, can improve your story. So that is potentially a good use for it, but ultimately that is going to stop being effective because it doesn't know actually what you're writing and what you mean to write. It's actually more so just giving you common answers and common feedback of what kind of feedback someone would give on the kind of writing you're asking it to give you feedback on. And so it might actually not relate at all to what you're writing, but just sort of the overall genre of helpful feedback. So that's ultimately at some point going to stop being beneficial. There's also a related question here. What also I would suggest you don't use AI to do is to basically edit or polish or correct the grammar of your final essay. Because ultimately, AI makes mistakes. I mean, I could even go back and show you in the examples that we just went through some mistakes that it made. And so we might as well go ahead and do that. So certainly something like ChatGPT is not guaranteed to give you completely correct grammar. And so even if we just look at this one example here, okay, um, something like these examples. But sometimes without warning, the conversation widened. College, period. Money, period. His childhood, period. Those are all three incomplete sentences, right? And so, you might not care exactly, or it might sound fine, or maybe, I mean, ostensibly the reason why it's doing something like this is because a lot of people do it, right? It's giving you common answers. But technically, those are incomplete sentences and not correct grammar. And so even just that one example, you see that it's not guaranteed to give you correct grammar. So I wouldn't have it do that for you. So in other words, don't have it correct your essay once you finish it. And the other reason why I wouldn't suggest that is because again, it is gonna by default sort of take away any sort of distinguishing features of your voice and replacing it with the most common version of that kind of genre, right? And so ultimately it's going to look and read like exactly like we just saw. And so you take away all the benefit of writing it yourself when you turn it back over to AI and say, all right, now correct the style and do all this. And it can kind of appear, at least in certain places, maybe even better or enhanced or things like that, but ultimately there's no guarantee that it's actually better or correct. All right, and so along the lines, I've already been sort of answering this, right? How do I make sure my essay still sounds like me if I use AI? Number one, I've said don't, use AI for this purpose, and it's just super hard to get to once you have an AI written essay to go back and try and edit it and make it sound like you. At most, you could sort of replace some of the vocabulary, be like, I don't know that word, I would use this word, things like that, but then the whole sort of grammar and syntax and the order of the sentences and punctuation, right, is likely going to be a whole different thing than what you typically would write yourself. And it's just going to be too hard to try and go back and tell AI to fix it or fix it yourself. It's going to be much easier to just write it yourself. Um, so can AI help me figure out what topic to write about if I have no topic? Short answer, yes. I think that is one good use of AI is to, brainstorm topics with you. But again, you want to land on the best topic that you think. You don't want to rely just on AI to tell you, oh, this is going to be the best topic for you to write about. All right. And so, should you disclose that you use AI if you do use AI in your essay? And so, ultimately, I would say if you feel like you have to disclose that you used AI, then you used it too much. And so, you should go ahead and rewrite your essay so you don't feel like you need to do that. Um, so if you use it for brainstorming, if you use it for outlining, I don't think anyone would have an objection to doing that, right? Like it's common practice on college campuses to the college to provide writing tutors, right? And what's one thing, which I was one, what's a common thing we offer to do is help you brainstorm and write outlines, right? That is perfectly in the bounds of something that is acceptable to get help on, right? And so where it crosses the line is if someone's actually writing it for you. And so you would want to stop short of that. And as long as you do that, you shouldn't have a problem. All right. How do I know if my essay is cliched? So like I was talking about today, if you don't get specific about, really fine details of your own life, then it's more likely to be something that anybody could experience, and it's going to be general and vague and going to sound cliched. So one of the ways to try and avoid that is to really go into specific detail about, things like what you saw, what you felt, what you thought, and then that is much less likely to be cliched. Um, all right, and then so this is, I think, one of the last ones we'll take. How personal or vulnerable should I be? So obviously, if you were to use AI, it kind of takes that question off the table, and so this is something you'd have to grapple with. And so I would say certainly in the early stages, don't take anything off the table of what you think you might want to write about. And so that goes the same for the question of like, should I not write about certain topics because they're too common or they're taboo or something like this? So the same thing here. Um, should I not write about it because it's too personal? I would say in the beginning, explore any ideas that you do have because they may turn out to be really good, right? You may at some point, the other thing could happen. You may at some point decide, hey, I don't really feel comfortable sharing this. And so, of course, then you would set it aside and try something new. But you don't want to limit yourself to trying to write about things you care about right from the start. So with that, I will end it there. And I hope you found this helpful. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for watching, and have a good day.